Should you trust personality frameworks? This is a question I'll be tackling today. First, let's clarify what I mean when I use the term personality framework. I would broadly define them as systems that divide the population into several personality groups or types based on a set of rules that are usually built on top of a list of dichotomies, such as the famous extraversion introversion polarity. To give a couple of examples, the Big Five, the Howland codes, also known as RIASEC, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the Enneagram, and astrology are all pretty famous systems that can reasonably be considered to fall within the scopes of personality frameworks. There are a couple of reasons why many people enjoy using them. They can be a fun lens of analysis to look at the world through. They can help understand yourself and others better, as well as offer tailored self-improvement tips. On the other hand, they also face some serious concerns regarding their potential for superficially pigeonholing people, as well as their lack of scientificity and accuracy. So in this video, I'll be addressing the main criticism, the one that I'm aware of at least, that are levied at the general idea of grouping human personalities into categories as a means to glean insights. I won't really be focusing on any single specific framework, but more the general idea and the type of way it tends to play out. And then I'll give my assessment on whether this whole endeavor is worthwhile in spite of its potential shortcomings. There's a decent amount of things to cover, so I'll try not to take too much time and be fairly quick. Let's start with the first family of criticism, which is around pigeonholing or essentialism. And by essentialism, I mean it's kind of the idea of setting in stone characteristics of people, right? So like saying that someone is a specific way, they can never change. Usually also it's like it's inherent to them and it's always been there and it will always be there. So that's kind of the general types of criticism we'll be tackling first. So I guess the main first form of criticism is the idea that each individual is much more complicated and nuanced than any simple category can describe. And I would agree with that sentiment, right? Like, of course, the whole point of these systems of types is to regroup people based on commonalities and contrasts. I also find it interesting or weird that this type of criticism is often targeted at personality frameworks when there's a lot of other ways where we do this in life in very crude ways, such as the famous masculine feminine binary, where a lot of personality traits are associated with each of those binaries, and many people don't seem to care that much about it. But when it comes to some more refined, usually at least, categories that you can find in personality frameworks, this is a common criticism. I think there's also another point to take into consideration is that there are different types of personality traits, right? There's like the central traits, for example, that's what the Big Five is trying to describe, or for example, extroversion, introversion, neuroticism, orderliness. So like kind of common central traits that are or that where people will belong on one end of the polarity, at least on one at one point of the polarity. Most people kind of fit into these general categories. And then you have secondary personality traits, which are much more numerous and and much more specific, and then these are they'll create more subcultures than really like a broad personality categories. So things like what you like, for example, people who like metal, are also like subcultural groups like hippies who can have like a cluster of interest that kind of gravitate around another, or punks, or you've got again other things you might like Harry Potter fans, or soccer fans. So like many of these secondary traits, there's so many of them, it's impossible to make any exhaustive categorization system. I don't even know if they would be super interesting, because that's like a lot of little traits. And sure, maybe for a specific person, the fact that they're a fan of a specific thing is like a massive uh, self-identified trait of their personality. But if you're trying to categorize people in a couple of categories, it makes more sense to be focusing mainly on the central traits So of course, you won't be able in a profile that describes a type using those systems to list every single part of a person's personality. I don't think that's ever been the point. If you think about it, usually those systems kind of have from 3 to 30 types of or categories of personalities, and the type prevalence for each one of those types tend to range from the 1% or maybe a little bit less to 30% or maybe a little bit more. And if you think about it, right, there's currently about 8 billion human beings, at least at the time where I'm recording. If you even take only 1% of that, right, so a type that would be 1% of the population, that is still 80 million individuals. So of course there's going to be a lot of intertype differences that you won't be able to describe or to, exhaustively list by using a category. But I don't know that that's like such a big problem. I think this is a bit of a perfect solution fallacy. In the same way that putting on your seatbelt won't guarantee that you won't get any injury at 100%. It doesn't mean that not putting it on serves no value. So, same thing with getting shot when you're wearing a bulletproof vest. I mean, you might still get hurt, but I mean, if you ask someone, they're probably going to take the bulletproof vest anyway because you've got better odds of not getting wounded as bad. So I think the same thing applies here. The categories don't need to be perfect to describe every single trait about a person, as long as they're decent enough to extract enough value or insights. And also, I think that personality framework should be complemented by more individualized means of understanding yourself. But I don't think that means they should be prescribed as a whole either, right? So it's fine to use more personalized ways of thinking about your self-concept through a lot of different means, not just personality frameworks. But I don't think I don't think that invalidates them. Another type of criticism in the general family is the idea that personality frameworks can devolve or lead to some vapid forms of prejudice and stereotypes. Like I think the most famous version for this or example is astrological types, where, for example, some types, if I remember correctly, Scorpios and Cancers are, labeled or considered as bad people. And so, that's not a great thing if these systems are leading to, a lot of hasty and judgmental stereotypes, especially in the case of astrology, because you're born, it's not even you're not even associated on it based on your actual personality. It's just like you're born this time of year, and then people will have a lot of ideas about what that means about you. Now, I think that usually these forms of stereotypes stem from shallow level understanding of the systems. Usually, people that know them in more depth and have thought about it deeper don't tend to use or make heavy use of stereotypes as much. And they also come from excessive certainty and dogmatism about those misunderstandings or about the system in general. So now I'll admit that this tends to be pretty prevalent with personality frameworks, but I mean it kind of makes sense given that it kind of just divides the population in several groups. And so you could say that that's kind of an issue because by doing that it becomes kind of a breeding ground for this type of problematic behavior. But on the other hand, I'd say that it's not like that's the only place where it happens. We have a lot of pretty low level prejudice, pretty generalized in life, even without those systems. And people judge and gatekeep based on many things, including the secondary traits we mentioned before, like being part of a fandom or whatever. So, sure, it is a problem that comes with personality frameworks, and it's good to keep in mind and to try to avoid this pitfall. But I don't think that, it's a problem that's uniquely contained within them. Then the third and last branch of criticism that I want to cover in this general family of criticism, this idea of personality determinism, which is the most, which plays into this whole idea of essentialism. But that, and I think a specific concerning one or concerning part of this criticism is saying that because you're kind of getting stuck into this, this category or this list of traits, it's limiting your potential for growth and change by kind of putting arbitrary constraints on you and saying, you'll always be a certain way. For example, you'll always be introverted and therefore shy, and you can never grow past that. So that's kind of a problem, right? You wouldn't want to box people in and stop them from trying to improve themselves. And I do think there's some legitimacy to this point, especially depending on the system. Some systems are pretty inflexible, especially if it's type systems. You're usually one type and you don't change. And then how you get, put into that type depends. Sometimes it's based on your behavior and preferences. Other times it's just based on your birth date. So in this one, it's really rigid. But on the other hand, you don't have to, you don't need to, let yourself be constrained by those limits, or you're free to make use of your own discernment to see whether that makes sense or not. And then I think that although it's got this negative potential to stifle people's growth or the way they see themselves, I do think that on the other hand, it also is helpful in the topic of growth, because by showing some weaknesses and pitfalls of different categories of personality, they usually can give you some tips or strategy on how to avoid them or how to best go about growth. And although they might not all be perfect, it can be a good source of inspiration to try and grow. And you could, you can also take inspiration from other types. And it's just like new ways of thinking about things that can help you, try and approach or tackle problems in new ways. So, I mean, I do definitely think this is a potential, it's a negative, and it can have an effect. But I don't think it's like, it can be counteracted. There are other benefits, so it's a bit of a mixed bag on this point. Then on the moving on to the second family of criticism, which is more about how accurate are they, and this whole idea of lack of scientificity, which is kind of a recurrent problem for most of these systems. So the first, criticism comes from the tests that are used to kind of sort people into these categories. And so tests that are made about a person's psychology are called psychometric tests. And within science, there's a couple of criterion you need to follow to make a good psychometric test. So they need to be accurate, as in they measure what they're measuring correctly. So if we're using the example of measuring your height, I'll be using the metric scale or system. So if you're 2 meters tall, you want your measuring tape to actually say that you're 2 meters and not some other wrong measure, right? Well, that's the first criterion. Then they need to be reliable, as in meaning that when you measure the same thing, you should get the same result, right? If you measure your height one day and then the next day you've lost 20 centimeters or gained 20 centimeters, I mean, when you haven't changed your height, that's weird. There's something wrong with the measuring tool. And lastly, it needs to be sensible, as in the right thing needs to be measured, right? So if it's claiming that it's measuring a specific thing, that's what it should actually be measuring rather than something else. And that can get pretty tricky within the realm of psychology and how people's minds work. And so for most typing systems out there, most personality frameworks, when they do have tests, they're not very good. Most of them kind of fail on the psychometric criterions. So, for example, they usually tend to have variations across several testings, so the reliability isn't great. So if you take the test one day, and then maybe a couple months later you take the test, you might get a different result. That's not as much of an issue for trait-based systems. So here I'll try to quickly explain the difference between two main types of personality frameworks. Some are based on just traits, so it'll take a couple of dichotomies like introversion, extroversion, and then rate you along that spectrum, right? So, for example, the Big Five is a famous trait system. Now, because these systems don't make any assumptions on how rigid or flexible your measure is, right? It basically just measures how you rate on this trait compared to most other people. But there's no assumption that you can't change over time, right? So in the big five, it's fine. Like it's not a problem for you to become more extroverted across time. Now it's more of a problem when you use type-based systems where you basically belong into one type, one category based on the different measurements or different criterias, and then you're not really supposed to be changing. So, for example, the Meyer-Briggs type indicator, which is also all based on a test. If you take the MBCI, so that's a shortened version of that name, you might change type across different measurements or different tests, which should not happen because you're supposed to be only one type. So that's more of an issue for these types of systems. Another type of problem that can arise with these tests is that they have correlated traits. So again, if we take the MBTI and the Big Five, because those two systems are pretty similar, one of the ideas of the Big Five is that the main concept is that they've tried to extract the essence of many personality or ways of defining personality and find the general themes beneath all those descriptions, and reduce it to 5 themes. And an important idea is that these 5 themes are not correlated, right? Like they don't kind of mesh with one another, and this to avoid redundancy or muddled results where you're actually kind of testing for the same thing in different ways. So that's a problem that can appear in other types of tests, and that can kind of bring some doubts on how pertinent and relevant some of these categorizations are. But even for tests which have a pretty decent rating on a psychometric level, like the Big Five, which tends to be pretty well regarded within the scientific community. At least it's one of the best regarded compared to the other, which most of the others are not at all. But even the Big Five faces some criticism. So although within the Big Five, so you got those 5 traits, and they're all at least supposed to be very different. Each trait is separated from the others, and it's not supposed to be correlated. There are some criticism about how you define each trait, like because if different researchers don't define the trait in the same way, then they're not really measuring the same thing, and so that's another way where things can get murky. So I think that these criticism on psychometrics are a good criticism. They bring up some legitimate points. In general, measuring psychological things tends to be pretty tricky. It's based on subjective data. I mean, like you're making objective statistics and measurements, but based on subjective data, so it's always complicated. And I think that in general, these tests are imperfect tools. I mean, even the Big Five, but I guess the difference with the Big Five is that it's making lesser claims than other types of tests. But it's just giving you how you score, given a list of questions on each of these different traits compared to the rest of the population. So you're within the middle, or maybe you're low on extroversion, or maybe you're high compared to most other people. But I think that it's important to, when you're using these frameworks, so if you want to use these frameworks, the tests are limited, and they should be used with some lucidity, and that they tend to be fairly imperfect. They're like kind of maybe like a jumping point to get you to start getting you thinking, but they tend to be limited, and it's good also to avoid overplaying their scientificity, which I think is definitely a thing that some of these systems do. Like they kind of overplay the strengths of their tests, especially the Meyer-Briggs, which is the official system is all based on the test, so that's kind of a problem. And on the same front, I think that some among different personality frameworks, some people tend to make some pecking orders of some system being more scientific than another. But in truth, I think that most personality frameworks out there are not very solid on the scientific front, because, and usually their best claim to scientificity is to have some correlation with the Big Five, which even itself is fairly criticized, or it's not like it's the firmest of them all, but it's not perfect either. So I don't know, like I think that this kind of appeal to scientificity, when a lot of these systems are more psychological or rather philosophical, and kind of rely on ideas or concepts that are not really testable, experimentally testable and falsifiable, and therefore not really scientific. I don't really know. I don't really think that's a way to defend or promote the system. Another form of criticism for these systems is what is called the Barnum or Four effect, and also confirmation bias. And basically, the whole idea of the Barnum effect. There's this famous experiment where I think a teacher gave a short description, and it was the exact same description to all his students, and asked them to rate on, I think, from a scale to 1 to 10, how well it describes them as an individual, the description. And basically everybody rated it very high, thinking that it really describes them as an individual very well, when in fact basically everybody resonated with it. And so this idea of the Barnum effect, you read a description and you think, wow, this describes me so well, but in fact it actually describes many people decently, and we tend to overrate how finally something is kind of tailored to us, when in fact it just speaks to most people. Now I think that, so that's kind of a problem within personality frameworks, because it might mean that you relate or associate with a category or personality type, when in reality it's not super pertinent or relevant or really a perfect match for you. I think that this problem is reduced when you have several types which are pretty clearly and have pretty cleaving descriptions or and divisions, right? So if the profile of the personality types has some pretty or some traits or some descriptions which would only correspond to an actual minority of the population, then that's less of a problem, especially since you have different types and they have some pretty stark differences. There's less chances that you'll think, oh, every type or any type is perfect or is really good match for you, when it's not. Now I guess another problem could be that because of the Barnum effect, when you might think that one of the types is a good match for you, when in reality none of them are really, it's just like the least bad of the bunch. But then again, I would say, like, my answer would be that personality frameworks don't need to be perfect to be useful. And in the last video I made, I was arguing that getting a couple of archetypes on ways to do things, on personality basically, is much more powerful than a single standard, because it helps you notice traits and patterns within yourself that you might not have thought about before. And you're also discovering some potential strategies and workarounds for them, or just noticing some patterns within yourself that you had never noticed before. And so even if the personality type is not perfect, even if there are some flaws in the systems, right, it's not a perfect description of reality. If it's good enough, if it's got some interesting ideas, it can already bring some value, just by offering new insights, new perspectives. And if you really resonate deeply with some aspects of a personality profile, isn't that already of value, even if it sometimes misses the mark or it's not perfect? Because like when you read the Barnum profile, like there's nothing that is particularly insightful in there, because it's all pretty basic stuff. You can read the text; it's easily available on the internet. But in those more detailed and personalized personality frameworks, even if there are some flaws here and there, or the system is not perfect, just by like reading different aspects or different descriptions of personality, sometimes you'll find like a tidbit and you're like, oh, that's interesting, like that seems to really fit. So I think that when you're using personality frameworks, it's, although they tend to describe themselves as being, or they try to be as strong or very good at describing, which they might not be, or like they might tend to overplay how precise they are, we'll say. I think that a lot of their value comes in just more of a pragmatic aspect of finding new ways of thinking about things and thinking about you and other people, and differences, and how different ways of acting, of thinking, different types of perspective, it can enrich the way you think about yourself and others, without needing to be perfect, without having to be the absolute objective truth. Another branch of criticism within the scientific realm, we'll say, or that type of criticism or vectors of criticism, comes back to again what we talked about with traits and versus types, in that it seems or weird or a little arbitrary to collapse traits, which are spectrums, into rigid types, right? So and so again, if we take the big five versus the MBTI, within the big five, you just have a score on a spectrum, on a scale, from super introverted to super extroverted. Whereas if you type yourself with the MBTI, you'll either be an introvert or an extrovert, right? It's a type, it's one or the other. Now, the problem with that is that most human traits, and not just psychological, but even height, weight, etc., are like if you kind of map them on a graph, you'll get a bell curve, which looks like a little mountain, where basically you've got most of the people are in the middle, around the average, and then you've got very little people on the extremes. So if you take height again, for example, most people are of average height, and then you've got a couple of outliers, but are very rare, that are extremely tall or extremely small. Right? And the more extreme you go, the less people you have. So you've got this little mountain shape. Whereas if you think in terms of dichotomy, or like you have either one, it's either one of two things. Then if you were to map that out, it would more look like a camel's back with two bumps, where you've got a lot of people that are introverts, for example, and then a lot of people that are extroverts, and very little in the middle. But when you do map or measure and map these traits, most of them are a bell curve. So it seems weird that you'd arbitrarily snap people in one corner when in fact most people are actually average. So if, for example, in introversion and extroversion, most people are basically what you'd call ambiverts, so to speak, and then you've got only a couple of people that are super introverted or super extroverted. So that's actually a good criticism also. It seems that it's these like rigid types seem a little bit weird when you take that into consideration. But then I'll still give a couple of counter arguments. One of the things is that types tend to be more insightful as conceptual tools when we're talking about thinking about how you're different from others, how you contrast what is true about you. Types tend to be, the fact that they're more cleaved is more informative, because basically, for example, and if you take the Big Five test, it's interesting because you can kind of see where you rank compared to most people. But it's only very interesting if you learn that you're super or like if you're in a very small minority, right? Like if you're extremely introverted or extremely extroverted or extremely neurotic or extremely conscientious, for example, that's interesting because it's telling you a way in which you're very different from other people, and so that might explain some things in your life, some struggles you have. Whereas if you just learn that you're in the middle, pretty average score, well, you're not really learning much. That's not super insightful. Whereas types, by being more rigid and more clearly defining differences, tend to have more potential for insight. Another thing, another benefit of these kind of more thinking more in terms of polarities and being more dividing between one side and the other, is that it kind of leaves some room for the interplay between different dynamics. Whereas, so basically, if you just get one score on a spectrum, it might be the result or the average or the aggregate result of a lot of sub-factors, right? So maybe you, in some ways, are very extroverted, in some ways, you're very introverted. It depends on different contexts or different dynamics within you. But then, your average score will just be in the middle. And so you don't really learn much about those underlying factors through that score. Whereas types can help with that, because usually types are based on a couple, like on a layering of different polarizations or different dichotomies. And then through that interplay, you can kind of understand how, or at least it can give a little bit more of an understanding on how those different dynamics or contradiction within yourself can work out. So, and I talked about that in a video called One-Dimensional Scales or Gross Oversimplification. But, then again, I will say that's a good criticism. but I just wanted to point out this potential of types for insights. So with that, I've covered most of the criticism, well, basically all the criticism I could think of that I've seen, and that seem to be, decent, or that carry some weight, we'll say. Although that was pretty long, unfortunately, but at least it's done now. And to go to the conclusion, I do think there are a lot of legitimate criticism of personality frameworks, and people that tend to like them, I find, usually underplay them, or are not really, they don't really address them properly, I find. But I also think that there are definitely some positives, some advantage and benefits to using them, as long as you're doing so responsibly, right? With using your discernment, being lucid about their weaknesses, and using them as conceptual tools for growth, but reasonably, by keeping in mind the potential problems, the different pros and cons of different systems. And I'm not saying all systems are good. I think some systems are not very good. So, for example, I mentioned astrology. I don't use that one. I don't think it's great for reasons I won't get into in this video. But I do think that there is some values to be extracted from these systems. And I think a quote that summarizes my perspective very well is the following by Karl A. Menninger from his book, I think, The Human Mind, where he says, "Experience has shown that personalities may be grouped into various major categories, and for purposes of studying them, this is a helpful device. Classifications must never be taken too seriously. They ruin much thinking, but the fear to use them has prevented much more thinking." And I think that's a good summary of the topic. So I think that, to answer the initial question, it's fine to use them. I mean, if you don't want to use them, or if you think that the criticism are too glaring to use them, that's fine. That's your choice. But I think that it's fine to use them, and to kind of explore them with some critical thinking by using your own discernment. If you like this video, you might also be interested in the last one I did, which was called "Are You Lost Cause or You're Simply Different?", which is the one in which I explored this idea of the strengths of having a couple of archetypes to consider rather than a single standard, and how that can be really liberating and help you, make progress. And I'll make upcoming videos where I make some overviews of a couple of systems or personality frameworks that I have found interesting personally. And, again, go over some of the pros and cons. So you might be interested in those when they come out. In any case, thanks for listening, and see you later.